Well, welcome. I hope you've had a pleasant lunch. Those of you who had time to have some lunch. And I hope you're in for a really interesting, I know you're in for a very interesting afternoon. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but the question often arises, and at a meeting like this, one can safely say that there's not one of the individuals who is sitting here whose lives or the lives of their family have not been touched by addiction. Think about it. You know, so often we sit in audiences where there are third and fourth generation Seventh-day Adventists, and people are horrified to think, can this be the case? Absolutely. Addictions are no respecters of persons. We find them everywhere. Just in 2003, one of the tasks that I really enjoyed, one of the projects that I enjoyed, was I enjoyed the project, but I didn't enjoy the information. The topic on Adventists and addictions. Something that we keep in the closet. Somebody who's worked very hard in addiction says that often churches are in denominational denial and the congregational closet. And so for this afternoon, we have selected some speakers, some outstanding speakers, who have wonderful expertise in their field, who are passionate about the work they do, and who are very keen to get to the heart of the issue of addictions and healing. Our first speaker is Dr. Kiti Randall Freier. She is not only an accomplished psychologist, she's actually a very nice person. She's the kind of person who, when you talk to her, you begin to wonder what she's busy assessing about you. Fortunately, I know her well enough to know that some of the things that she can't assess about me. But she comes with a very rich track record. She's been a full professor of psychology at Loma Linda University, and she still teaches through that institution. She has special interests in drug-endangered children and how addictions affect the family. Now, the family is one of the most affected parts by the issue of addictions. And this was illustrated again towards the end of 2010 in a paper that came out in Great Britain, pointing out that alcohol is more harmful than cocaine when you look at the community effect and the effect that it has on individuals and families. Kiti still continues to be involved in teaching, in project work, in research, and she's a mentor as well to many people. We're delighted that she's accompanied today by her husband, Mark, who's, I think, an exercise.
He's a psychologist.
He's a psychologist. Oh, brother. These two psychologists live in wedded bliss. And we're delighted that you're here as well, Mark. And thank you for coming to share with us not only your expertise, your very deep knowledge, but also your passion. I'm going to say one more thing about Kiti. Some years back in Colorado, there was the founding meeting of the Drug Endangered Children, the National Drug Endangered Children Group in the United States. And Dr. Freier was invited to be the keynote speaker. And I think, I don't know, there must have been 1,000 people there. About 1,000 people were there. And these were not church people. These were attorneys, law enforcement individuals, drug agency people. And she gave the keynote address and not only gave the facts, the research around the issue, she gave the heart of the matter with a solution that comes through love and Christ. And you know, it was a most moving occasion because she was given a standing ovation. It's not common in meetings like that to see that sort of response. And so without much further ado, Kiti, the time is yours, and it seems that your colleagues are going to give you almost as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon. With that introduction, Peter has given me a long way to fall, so hopefully we won't do that. It won't help you do that. But the issue of addictions and healing, as Dr. Landless said, I'm a pediatric neurodevelopmental psychologist, and my specialty is to work with children who come from homes where substance abuse is a problem. And so I spend a lot of my time and in my life working with children who've been harmed in some way by substances and trying to find ways to help them with their healing. I'm going to take a little bit of different stance. I'm not going to tell you a lot about the children per se, but more the issues of healing and addiction. A lot of what I'm going to share with you is actually, much of it is written in an article that I wrote with Dr. Todd Burley at Loma Linda University, and it's in the Adventist Review. There was an addiction special issue in 2003, so a lot of that comes from that. But what I want to share with you is an understanding that addictions are not behaviors developed to fulfill illegitimate needs, but rather learned behaviors to fulfill legitimate needs. And I'm hoping as we have this time this afternoon that you'll get a better sense of what I mean by that. If you look at what is an addiction, it is really any habitual imbalance. Habits, you know, we understand habits. It's a habit with an imbalance, okay? It's done at the cost of a balanced life. Now, if I wasn't saying we were talking about addictions, you might think that we were actually at a meeting where we're talking about church workers who are working too hard, right? Because we often talk about the issue of a balanced life and the need for that. So I want you to start putting this frame around what we're saying. In the diagnostic manual that we use in psychology and psychiatry, when you have an addiction that creates an imbalance, it must also have a functional impairment, meaning some impairment in relationship or impairment in occupation. Occupation for an adult is our jobs. Occupation for a teenager or a young child might be to go to school. Occupation might be to play as a very young child. So when we think of addiction, it must be related to the fact that there's a cost to the balanced life that impairs a relationship or your sense of purpose or what you do in life. Now that takes us right away into what we've been talking about in a lot of what we've shared so far. The other thing, as Dr. Landless hinted, is that addiction knows no boundaries, okay? There are no boundaries. It was sort of like there's no geography boundaries. It was sort of my disappointment coming to Europe several years ago and realizing I don't get a stamp in my passport everywhere I went. There's less boundaries here. But addiction has no boundaries. It is global. There are no ethnic boundaries. There are no culture boundaries. In fact, some cultures, and when we think about addiction, we have to think about it in terms of how is it acceptable or not acceptable to that culture? I know, working very closely and having some friends, and one of my friends' mom was from South America. And they were not allowed to have caffeine or coffee in their house, but there was this special tea that they got from South America that I'll tell you, when I drank that, that was way harder on my body than drinking coffee might have been. But in cultures, there's different ways we look at what is an addiction, what is not an addiction, what is okay for you to have and what is not. There's no boundary of religion. It doesn't matter what religion you're in. There is no boundary of age. You can be born with, we don't call it addiction, but we call it with the need for abstinence because you have already been exposed to it. And there is no boundary of gender. When I first began in this field about 26 years ago, when I would go out and talk about the effects of substances prenatally on children, at the time, when you would talk about addiction, most people had in their brain, they were thinking about a man. Addiction was connected to more the male gender. Now, at least half of the addicts are women, which means there's an increase in the number of children being born exposed. So there is no boundaries in terms of substances. So as we talk about addictions, meaning that there's an imbalance in life that in fact impacts relationships or occupation, you might want to think, what is mine? What is our own addiction? Instead of always thinking about other, to make sure that you understand we are in this together. Some people today are techno addicts. They have to have the latest. And I know with some friends in their relationships with others that they go into significant amount of debt needing the latest technology that's out there. Things that are acceptable addictions, a workaholic. Some of the benefits to that are ones we get praised for. In fact, many addictions, at the beginning of the addiction, you get praised for how you're behaving and the kinds of things that you're doing because you might be very productive. But after a while, there might be functional impairment. I come from a family where work was the most valued thing. I remember my mother was Latvian and my father's side is German. And there was a strong work ethic. And I remember being about 5 years old, and I was sitting on the stairway, and it was Sunday morning, about 7 o'clock in the morning. And I remember my grandfather, and I was called Kato. I guess that might be Latvian, I don't know. But he said, Kato, everyone is sleeping still. And they only remember to rest on the seventh day. They forget the commandment is 6 days shalt thou labor. And I was like, okay, I'll go, Opa, I'm going to go do my chores right now, right? He was very driven by that. There was a lot of that. So sometimes, if it's impairing functional status, work can also be an addiction. For some people, it's busyness, the inability to just be. We have to have something going all the time. For some of us, and we would say, why not if you want, but for some of us, we have an addiction to being needed. It relates strong to the core of the human nature, but if it becomes so important that it creates an imbalance, it can be an addiction. What about codependency? I was recently listening to he's a fabulous speaker, and he's also a comedian. He was an addict to substances much of his life. And he was talking about, he goes, you know how a drug addict looks for who's the codependent, meaning who's the one who's going to be there for me all the time? You tell them something sad that happened to you, and the ones that go, aw, those are the ones you're attracted to because those are your codependents, right? Those are the ones that you might see as people who will always be there. Their needs are not met, always trying to meet everyone else. What about worry? Some people say that biblically worry is a sin. Can it be an addiction? For many in our culture, food is an addiction. For some, shopping. I know one of the addictions that is easily covered up and is a very significant issue, particularly also in the clergy, is that of pornography. And substances, of course, when we think of addiction, we often think of substances. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We don't have time to go into what are the theories of addiction. There are many different theories, and actually addiction is very complex. There is more and more that's coming out in terms of genetics or epigenetics, in terms of things that might be in our genetic code for addiction. We often talk about the sense of self, not being comfortable with self. We talk about depression, the need for something to alter mood. For some people, it's a significant loss in life. That was the thing that started the issue of addiction. For others, it could be peer pressure, particularly when you're young. For many, it's the cycle of addiction, which means that it's the next generation of those who are in those homes. No matter the theory or the etiology, most of the persons, particularly in substance abuse addiction, that I have been friends with said when they took the substance, it filled the hole. That they felt empty or void before, and it was the first time that they might have felt filled. They felt good about themselves or about life in general. Addiction is complex, and if we're going to understand it, we must understand it from a wholeness perspective. It affects or interacts with us cognitively, neuropsychologically, socially, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. All of those are impacting us in terms of addiction. Every society has used substances. When we think about addiction to substances, every society has used it. In fact, when you look in the Bible, there's many accounts of what? Drunkenness in the Bible and the consequences of that have occurred. So historically, we know that substances have been there. And why? Why are substances so appealing to so many is because, with the exception of steroids, which are used for a different thing in terms of addiction, typically you're using a substance to alter your mood, to alter your thoughts, or to alter your feelings. The way you do that with the substances you take are the impact they have on the brain. Now, we don't have time to go into the neurobiology or the neurochemistry of how addiction works on the brain. But what I want you to know is it works on what we call neurotransmitters, the way that information is passed on the brain. The ones you often hear of, or you might have heard of, often you'll hear serotonin or dopamine or epinephrine. And some of us think those are the only neurotransmitters, when in the brain we think there's about 200 of them. The reason you only hear those and that the drugs you hear overlap on those are because those are the ones that travel to the areas of the brain that alter mood, that alter thought, and that alter feeling. I'm not going to take something that makes me feel horrible, although most drugs do over time, but not on the initial. And so this is how we look at substances. Substances we use to alleviate pain, anxiety, depression. For some of us, we want to be calmer or sleep. For others of us, we want to be energized. Though therapeutically useful for feeling good, many substances, because of the impact and how the body reacts to them, become something that becomes abusive. And the stronger the feel good, the more likely what? The addiction. If it's not powerful, you're not going to use it, right? So that's how we look at substance abuse addiction. The problem also with substance abuse is it's characterized by compulsive and sometimes uncontrollable drug craving and seeking that persists even in the face of negative consequences in life. In fact, most substances, as you know, produce dependence both physically and psychologically. And for many people, this can become chronic, that even after years and years of not using a substance, you can have long periods of abstinence and then have a relapse for this. Some of the consequences then of using substances we talked about. When does it become abusive? It becomes abusive when it impairs your functioning. It impairs your relationships. Some of the things we see in younger people is more delinquency. They're falling out of school or having school problems. They're not going to school. Obviously, and Dr. McBride has done a lot of work in this area, that substances is very related to criminal behavior. It's also related to homelessness, because if you are not productive and functional in your life, we see with those who use substances, we see a decline in their social economic strata for most people, unless you have a lot of independent wealth. So we see higher rates of homelessness. Shame, I'm going to talk about that because that's a very significant consequence of substance abuse. Relationship problems, isolation, unemployment, poverty. And the thing, what happens? More addiction, right? It's not covering it. You might have more addiction, poor anger management, and a chaotic lifestyle. The thing is that mental health, the way, if you look at the World Health Organization, your ability to function healthfully and reach your potential in the world is very connected to substance use. And if you look in the literature, more and more we're realizing that initially it was a mental health issue and then a substance abuse issue. Now, there are always exceptions to that with young people who might have been doing well but had peer pressure, or somebody who had a significant loss in life. But then that became a mental health issue that started. But in general, what we see is that mental health issues are typically the first in the chicken or egg scenario of substance abuse and mental health. Since the beginning of time, the environment has shaped human behavior, and so we see this issue. When you see substance abuse issues in the home, when you see addiction in the home, the family impact can be very significant because it decreases family function. You have more chaotic environments. Any addiction, actually, would create interpersonal problems in the family. We already talked about that in terms of addiction in the family. Any kind of addiction will create chaos in the family and role instability, meaning parents don't stay parents, or the control of parents don't allow for other roles to develop. There's poor interpersonal situations. The other thing is, now more particularly with substances, when there's addiction in the home, is that it affects the health, not only of the user, but also of the family members in the home. When a family, when the parents in the home are addicted to substances that we call more speed, okay? Many women like to take it because you're not hungry on it and you lose weight. In a lot of the homes where particularly methamphetamine, which is one of your most powerful addictions related to speed, happens, we see very little food in those homes. And so health and well-being, so nutrition, lack of food, secondhand exposure to substances. And now we know that even more consequential than secondhand exposure is what? Third-hand exposure, okay? And third-hand exposure is the substance being on your clothing, in your hair, in your home, in your environment, and think particularly of young children in those environments. If somebody's been smoking, or there's other, smoking whatever it is in the home, or toxins in the home, they're crawling on the carpet or on the furniture, and they're bringing that up. And we know those have even more consequences than secondhand exposure. And we see, obviously, because of some of the lifestyle issues, other sorts of things. So this is a mom, and in her family, she went from being the capable mom to being the substance-using drug mother who was addicted to substances. Well, I need to tell you that very often going into addiction, you do it for the right reason, but for the wrong outcomes. There's a part outside of Tennessee, near Nashville. There's a very wealthy suburb where there were they're upper-class women who want to be supermoms. So they want to be able to take their children to all the different activities they have them enrolled in. They want to stay up all night and make the cupcakes or the cookies, whatever, for their child to take to school. They want to make sure the house is all in order. They want to be able to do this. They want to make sure they're thin. All of those sorts of things. And so in this particular neighborhood, all upper-class women, they started using what they thought was going to be a great diet pill and give them the energy they needed to be supermom, and they started using methamphetamine. And in fact, being that it's illegal and they were cooking it in that neighborhood, many of those women ended up in jail and are strong addicts. This was one of those women. And what we see with that is that their intention was to be supermom, but in fact the addiction really started taking over, and we call it the walk-away drug because they actually walked away from everything they had in their life. When you have addictions, you have home and environmental safety issue, particularly with the drug-using lifestyle. Very unsafe or unhygienic environments. We also see the increased potential use for spouses. Okay? Most of the women I work with have said that they have learned to use substances from their partner. Okay? And most of the children who I work with who use substances learn to use it from whom? Their parents. The other thing is addiction will decrease your social support. And this is not just drug addiction. When you are addicted, whether it's to your busyness, to your work, to drugs, to anything, that becomes more important than anything else. And so you lose the social support network, which is exactly what you need to not struggle with addictions. It also impacts family culture. Like I said, the value system that happens in the addictive family is to walk away from everything important to you for the need of having that substance that fills you. Often there's also themes of violence in homes where there's substance abuse. And of course, the very significant thing, both in terms of domestic violence, but for harm to children, is the issue of the neglectful or abusive environment. One of the big issues in homes with addiction, of course, is losses. And for this little girl, when we asked her what did drugs mean to her in her life, it meant that her mom had died. And she was very, very impacted by the fact that she lost her mother to substances. So let's talk just for a few minutes on the impact of parenting in terms of drugs and parenting. Possession isn't 9/10 of the law, it is 9/10 of the problem. And it is a very significant issue. And I'll tell you, I'm originally from Canada, and in Canada, one of the things that we do there a lot in terms of addiction is what we call harm reduction. And so a lot of well-intended people go out and teach addicts how to use their substances when their kids aren't home, or how to keep it on a shelf, or all of those sorts of things. And they forget the fact that the child is still being raised by a parent under the influence. What we know in the United States is substance abuse contributes to 75%, and we see this as an underestimate, of the incidence of child abuse and neglect of children in the foster care system. In fact, 70% of all children who die because of abuse or neglect in the United States is because substances are in the home. What do we see for why are substances so significant in the parenting role? Is because when you're under the influence, how do children learn? What is their needs? They learn by repetition. They continue to want the interaction with you, and they're continually asking things over and over. Those of you who have young children know they may want to watch the same thing 100 times, or they ask you the same question 100 times, or they ask you, are we there yet 100 times, and they don't fall asleep. And they keep asking and keep asking. It takes a lot of good adult parenting skills in a developmentally appropriate way to continue to meet the needs of the children. But when you're under the influence of a substance, it is very difficult to meet those needs. When parents are under the influence of substances, they're often in a paranoid state, and I've seen children very significantly harmed, abused, and actually killed because their parents are in this particular state. Also because of the environment of the home. We also know emotional abuse is very significant in these homes. Whenever you have a home where there's chaos, One of the first things I do if I'm working with a family that's in distress, regardless of whether drugs are involved or not, is I ask them, you're having trouble with your child? Tell me, what is a typical day like in your home? Do you know most often there is no typical day? And what do children need more than anything for health and well-being is routine and structure and balance. And for sure, that's not happening in these environments. And of course, the chaos and the caregiver frustration. The other thing is when you're under the influence of something, you're more likely to do things than you would not do not under the influence. And we see a higher rate of sexual abuse in the substance using population. Okay. So when this little child was asked, what do drugs mean to you in your life? She drew this picture because drugs meant to her that when her daddy was using, that was when he would beat her. It's very significant to many children in terms of what's happening in their lives. The other thing, of course, is neglect. Not only are children abused, but in many environments, any environment where addiction, regardless of what kind of addiction, has taken over all of the occupation of the caregivers, there's the potential for neglect. With substance abuse, though, we see medical and safety neglect in addition to physical and emotional neglect, where there's no provisions in the home, where things are accessible to the child that can harm them, where they don't follow up on the medical needs and caregivers are not present. Sometimes when I say neglect, people kind of pass it by saying, oh, well, at least they're not harmed. Okay? At least, you know, if I neglect my children, it's not so bad because at least I didn't harm them. But when you're physically abused, you know, when we're born, our brain has so many, many, many different neurons that are available to make these connections. We've been talking about this connection. To make these connections, to develop pathways of function, those habitual ways we're going to learn to live in life, okay? When you're abused as a young child, you make connections, but they're not healthy ones. They're maladaptive ones. They're adaptive to that environment, but they're maladaptive in terms of healthy living. When you're neglected, what happens? You don't make any, right? You're not making connections because there's no stimulation. There's no response. So on the screen, you can see on the left side, you see the brain of a healthy 3-year-old child. And on the other side, I'm not good at these. So on this side, you can, I don't know if you can see that. Well, anyway, this is the brain of a healthy child. This child over here has had extreme neglect. Now, this is extreme because it's actually made so the brain has become much smaller. But what I want you to know by that neglect is no less than abuse in terms of the damage that it can do in your long-term developmental trajectory. For children growing up in homes where there's chaos or trauma or substance abuse, there are consequences in all areas of neurodevelopment. Physical consequences, behavioral consequences because they learn to behave in ways that are maladaptive, emotional costs by the sense of how you feel about yourself, cognitive consequences, neuropsychological ones, and one that is critical is that of meaning-making or values. And we'll come back to that because that is critical to what we see in terms of why children repeat the cycle. We know that in addictions, there's a family cycle of addiction. And in substance abuse, we know that children of parents who abuse substances are at the highest risk group of children to abuse alcohol and drugs. In fact, we see very often in these homes that in general, young people start experimenting with substances about 15 or 16 years of age. But if you come from an environment where substances are a problem, experimentation often occurs at 9 to 11 years of age. And so we're very concerned about this. There was just a new report out a couple weeks ago that talks about that youth substance abuse is increasing, that we're seeing a rise nationally and internationally on the issue of increased use with our young people of alcohol. And I don't know if there's anyone here from Russia, but I know I've been working with Russia to deal with some of the issues of the increase in alcohol use among young people in that country. It's devastating. Marijuana, where we have whole places like in Australia and Canada and now in the United States that are promoting it as a substance that's can be available. Prescription drug use is one that is very significant. A few years ago, we did, well, I'm guessing it's like 6 years ago now, we were in Romania. But we did a study in Romania and in Ukraine, and we were looking at what are the young people there telling us about substance abuse. And I thought, wow, we're in Europe, maybe it's not so bad here. It's not true. It's everywhere. We're young people. And in Ukraine, I remember the teachers telling us, you're not going to see, none of the children here are smoking because we don't allow it. And you talk to the kids, and the kids said the teachers don't think we're smoking because they're inside smoking and we're outside smoking, so they don't know that we're smoking because they're busy smoking. It's everywhere. We see it everywhere. But prescription drugs, what really scared me was the kids in the Ukraine, perhaps they didn't have money to buy drugs, so much of what they did was they would go, particularly they said, to their grandparents' medicine cabinet, because grandparents have substances, right? Because they're taking it and they would put it all in a bowl. Now, in the States, we used to have what we call the punch bowl parties, where everybody put whatever they brought from whatever they got, and you just take a handful and you drink it down. Now they call them the Skittles party, because I suppose more of the substances are different colors now. But one of the things that we saw is the kids in the Ukraine doing that. A lot of what their grandparents were taking was L-Dopa for Parkinson's. And it creates, it helps with the motor issue, but it could create motor issues if you have a normal brain. And so we're not sure what all of that would mean. But prescription drugs, and here's the thing is people don't get, they think because it's prescribed, it's somehow better. And I'm going to show you a slide on that because it's scary what people are thinking. Now they have what's called bath salts. I don't know if you have those stores in your country where they sell, little crystal charms and music and incense, alternative stores. And now they sell in those stores what they call bath salts. It's not to take a bath in. It's for kids to take, for young people or people to take. And spice, which is a synthetic marijuana, is also on the rise with young people. But here, in the most recent, this came out 2 weeks ago, where they talked about, with a household survey that was done by Drug Free America Partnership, that in that survey, 1 in 6 parents said using prescription drugs to get high is safer for the children than street drugs. So 1 in 6 parents says it's okay, it's better than if they use street drugs, that they're taking all those, which can be more highly addictive. And look at this. Almost 1/3 of the parents said attention deficit hyperactive disorder medication like Ritalin and Adderall, which is a stimulant drug, can improve their child's academic and testing performance even if they don't have ADHD. So the parents are promoting their children to get on drugs. These aren't drug-using parents. These aren't drug-addicted parents that you think about in the traditional sense. But we're promoting that. I'll tell you, I know more and more parents who get upset if they don't get the diagnosis and they don't get the medication because their kid will get behind in school and not have the same advantage as the other kids who are on drugs. I see it all the time. And I'm not talking about families who have substance abuse problems. I'm talking about our communities and our church communities where parents want their kids on medication to give them that edge in academia, because we are about work and achievement. But the cycle of addiction is very connected to social modeling. I know with the kids that I see who use substances, who are young teenagers, they said, you know, it was how my parents coped with life, it's how I cope. Many of them say, my parents taught me how to use drugs. They taught me how to smoke the marijuana. They taught me how to snort the cocaine or use the methamphetamine. And their average age of use is about 13 or 14. And that's not experimentation, 9 to 11, that's use. So when we think about how are we now, because it's such a complex thing, how are we now going to treat addiction? How are we going to help those who have addictions? Let me tell you that many psychological interventions for addictions have their roots in social learning theory. In this theory, it shows that addictive behavior is maintained by a well-organized but biased belief system. So you have a belief system that's keeping you in this behavior. And these beliefs will vary depending upon the person and the addiction. And some of the beliefs may seem more wrong and others simply different. So you need to know, it's like if we think this is all about your thinking, then our intervention models are what? Often going to be thought or knowledge-based. In fact, this is why we're so tempted to think that if someone would just change how they think or get more motivated, they could overcome their addiction. Now be honest. When you've seen people addicted to something, don't you think if they would just try harder, if they were motivated, if they would change how they thought about it? We often think that way. And so do many of our techniques in psychology. But there's a whole neuropsychology of addiction that I want to share with you that's very important in terms of working with people who have an imbalance in life. I'm not just talking drug users, although there's many of those in our own social networks. But what I'm talking about is persons who have an imbalanced life and it's impairing their function. Addicts are able to tell you, this is the cognitive part, addicts are able to tell you the negative aspects of their addiction. But this knowledge does not stop self-destructive behavior. Take most addicts down, they'll say, yes, this is how it negatively impacts me. But knowledge is not what's changing their behavior. Knowing better is not the same as doing better. I want to talk about the role of memory in this. And first I want to take you to Romans 7:19, where Paul says, I fail to practice the good deeds I desire to do, but the evil deeds that I do not desire to do are what I'm ever doing. Why do I do what I don't want to do? Why, even though I know better, do I continue to do this? Because there is a relationship between our memories and our addictions. Most addicts can tell you the negative outcomes of their addiction. But if they're asked to remember the experiences they've had related to that addiction, they typically have more positive ones to tell you about in experience. Memory for the addict is often the pleasure, the relief, and for a few moments, the world is finally right. This fight between knowledge and behavior seems wrong. Why were we created to have a fight between knowledge and behavior? But it is, in fact, an amazing and fascinating part of our neuropsychological makeup in the way that God made us and the magnitude of memory in our brains. Much of our behavior actually goes on without our conscious awareness. Do you know that? Much of what you do goes on without your conscious awareness. This was all described by Tolving in 1985, who's a Russian theorist on memory. The brain is designed for automation of behaviors and cognitive processes. Your brain needs to be efficient. It can't be learning everything new every day. It must reserve some processing for what's unusual or new learning. And so it puts out of your awareness many things that you've already learned that are habitual. And it speeds us up so that we can deal with situations in spontaneity. In Tolving's model, there are 3 memories, and some of you, I talked about it the other day. Okay, episodic memory, do you remember what that is? Ready for recognition and recall. It's an episode, an event that happened in your life. So if you want to say, going to Prague was an episodic memory, you can say, right in your recognition and recall. Have you ever been to Prague? Yes, I've been there, okay? It's right there. It's an episode in your life. Semantic memory, also in your awareness. Semantic memory is feeling memory, okay? An association. I have been to Prague. I was there with friends. I met friends. I made friends. It felt good. When I think about Prague and my trip there, I think positive thoughts. It's associative. Sometimes when you smell something, it will remind you of your childhood. It will remind you of grandma's kitchen or, you know, something like that, okay? It's a feeling memory. Procedural memory is outside of your awareness. It is your automatic skills. It is your automatic behaviors and your automatic attitudes. It happens outside your awareness. It is where you develop your self-worth, and it's where you develop your addictions. Ever since you were born, you had automatic ways of interacting with your world. Okay. I'm going to tell you about how quickly and lifelong an automatic memory can occur. In the United States, we have the Native American culture, the First Nation people. One of the tribes is called the Lakota Indians. The Lakota Indians, for them, hunting was a very, very important skill set to have because hunting was key to their survival. One of the attributes that is key to hunting is the ability to be silent. Because if you make noise and the prey or the animal gets away, your family could starve to death. So silence had to be something of the culture of reverence. Very, very important and revered. What they say in their history book was at the time of birth, when a baby was born, every time the baby cried, the mother would put her hand over the baby's mouth to the point of almost suffocation, so that the baby would pair crying with non-survival. It said that if the mother was consistent, behaviors, remember, consistency, if the mother was consistent for the first several hours of life, the baby never cried again. Now, I am not promoting this technique as a pediatric psychologist, okay? What I'm telling you is something about the impact of an event in your life that is so significant that it will impact you the rest of your life, because in your procedural memory, you know that silence is important and valuable. Now, what about ever since you were born, your needs weren't met? What about ever since you were born, you cried and nobody responded? What about when they did respond, they responded in very negative ways and harmed you? What about if the message you always got was you were never wanted, that you are a bother, that they wish you weren't there, or maybe more neutral, that you never knew if you were loved or wanted? Those records play in your head, in your procedural memory, outside of your awareness. And it's those records that start forming pathways of behavior that will become habitual, that become, when they're non-functional, become addictions. So if you were told your whole life that you would never amount to anything, that you were unworthy, and that you were unwanted, if those were the messages you continue to receive your whole life, your trajectory is likely that you would be somebody of unworth, unwanted, and rejected. We actually choose environments that continue to promote that way of thinking. Addictive behaviors have been likened to other highly skilled and automatic behaviors, such as playing the piano or driving the car. Now, driving the car in habitual memory is not always safe, particularly for those of us who drive on the right hand of the side of the street. If you go to places like England, South Africa, Australia, if you drive in procedural memory in one of those countries, what will happen? Yeah, you could kill yourself or somebody else, right? And so in one environment, it was adaptive. In another environment, it's maladaptive. But it's very, very habitual and responsive. Addiction, under the control of automatic behaviors and judgments, out of our awareness, it's just a part of what we do to fulfill a need, is not easily changed, especially if information is our only intervention. It wasn't laid down. Addiction is not laid down by information. Addiction treatment cannot be informational only. And it will never happen in shame. And I think that's an important part of what we need to be looking at it. Addiction can be procedural memories are laid down early in infancy. And it's during this time that an infant can be taught negative self-concepts. I told this story the other day, and I just want to say it again, how early on this happens. Philippe Rochat is a researcher in France on the development of the awareness of yourself. And he studies babies to look at how do we know when we are who we are. Because when we know who we are, we know who you are, and then we know what we think about ourselves, right? It all works together. We used to think that you were 5 or 6 before you had a development of self. But what he found, just watching babies, just looking at them, was that if you touch the corner of their mouth, do you know this reflex? The rooting reflex, right? You touch the corner of their mouth, they turn in the direction, right? You touch the corner of their mouth, they turn in that direction. It's for food, right? For survival. What he found is that in the first couple hours of life, a baby does not turn to their own touch. Within a couple hours, the baby learns, this is me touching me, then that's other touching me, and I only turn to other. Already the baby has developed a sense of self and knows how other treats them. This is how early down. In fact, most of your procedural memories, the ones that will become habitual and will lead you to addiction or not, are laid down in the first 18 months to 3 years of life. It reminds us how important it is to teach children to find appropriate ways to have pleasure, to feel good. Because I'll tell you, that's how we want. Our homeostasis, for most of us, some of us have aberrations, but for most of us, we want to feel good as our homeostasis. And we need to teach children from a very young age what is a healthy way to feel good. In procedural memory and addiction intervention, we need to help the addict to build new and valuable pleasures, new coping strategies for relief, new learning as to what would make us feel right. It is not enough to do less destructive behavior. We actually have to change the behavior that fulfills the need. You're actually changing neuronal pathways in the brain. It was relationships that set down the pathways in the brain that we just talked about. Therefore, it is relationships that become important in both raising awareness of the addiction. Remember, we were out of awareness. We have to come to awareness. And to allow and help develop new procedural and behavioral options and then help them lay back down into a better procedural memory. That takes a long time to move into awareness, to be there as a support system until it becomes a healthy way of relating. The psychology of addiction requires that we look at the wholeness of a person, including their spirituality. It must account for the fact, like I said at the beginning, that addiction is not behaviors to develop to fulfill illegitimate needs, but they are learned behaviors to fulfill illegitimate needs. What must be addressed then is that the specific addiction itself is not the best way to fulfill your need. We have to provide and help provide a way that this can be changed. What the Apostle Paul is talking about in Romans 7 is procedural memory and what is required for new and equally satisfying ones. If we are honest, each of us has unhelpful habits. Whether they are functionally impairing at the moment or not is not the question. I'm not calling you all addicts. But I am saying that we all have unhelpful habits. And any habitual or addictive imbalance is not good. Obviously, some are more destructive than others. There are differences in the degree of consequence based on our addictions or our habits. But we also must recognize what we all have in common, that when we have habits or addictions that impair function, that they impede our human freedom and diminish our human spirit. And we are working with those, when we work with people who have addictions, we are working with those who have impeded human spirit. What are our procedural addictive memories? Our own. This takes insight and work. But I think right now also of importance is to think about what are your procedural memories towards the addict? Our procedural memories towards the addict can often result in stigmatization, criticism, shaming, or do we have procedural memories that let us know that these are our fellow human beings that need us to be there in a positive way to support them? Once again, as we think about addiction and how we all might relate to this, I was listening to that speaker I told you about, Mark Lundholm, who's a former addict and who's a comedian and does a lot of work to try to raise awareness on addictions. And he talked about that each one of us have three voices. The first voice in our head is in our head, okay? The first voice is the voice in your head. It's the I know voice. It's all that information you have, that knowledge that you have. And what he said is be careful because your I know voice can lie to you, right? It's based on your own procedural memory. The second one is the voice in your heart. And he said we get it mixed up. The voice in our heart is not the I love voice. It's the I want voice because it's still based on us. And he said, love is want. I want my children to be happy and safe. I want my spouse to have this. I want that. Try not to get that confused because sometimes the heart voice can lie to us too. Lying to ourselves is more deeply ingrained than lying to others. And this is so much stronger when you have an addiction. The third voice is the I listen voice. It's the God voice. It's the truth voice. To be a good partner, healer, parent, teacher, this voice is connected to another source. It tells the truth. It's not our voice. It's God's voice. And what he said, which was so profound, he said, God's voice says, when the other two quiet down, I will talk. You have to have the other two shut off before I can talk. To give God voice, you need to be able to be in silence, which he said the addicted person cannot do without help. My sheep hear my voice and I know them. Our first duty of love is to listen. As one of the news anchor persons in the United States was interviewing Mother Teresa about prayer. And he asked her what she said during her prayers. And she said, I listen. So Mr. Rather turned the question around and asked, well, then what does God say to you? To that, Mother Teresa smiled with confidence and answered, he listens. And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you. The thing is, addiction is something that is learned over time that impairs function. It's laid down by relationship and can only be healed by relationship. But we have to engage with the addict to be able to be there as the social support system. Ecclesiastes 4, 8-12. 2 are better than 1. If one fall, the other pick him up. We need to be the social support for those around us, not to stigmatize them, but to draw them in that love.